Samuel Little was a serial killer who confessed to murdering 93 women between 1970 and 2005, with the FBI confirming at least 60 of these killings, making him the most prolific serial killer in American history as he targeted vulnerable women, including prostitutes and drug addicts, whom he would strangle after first knocking them unconscious with powerful punches from his boxing background. The story of Samuel Little is one of the darkest chapters in American criminal history. For over 3 decades, this man moved across the United States like a shadow, leaving behind a trail of death that would eventually make him the most prolific serial killer in the nation's history. His victims numbered in the dozens, women who lived on the edges of society, forgotten by many until one determined Texas Ranger finally got him to confess to crimes that had gone unnoticed for years. Samuel Little was born on June 7, 1940, in Reynolds, Georgia, a small town with barely 1,000 people living in it. The town sits about 100 miles south of Atlanta, a quiet place where not much happened. But from the very beginning, Samuel's life was anything but quiet or normal. His mother was just 16 years old when she gave birth to him. Her name was Bessie Mae Little, and she worked as what people politely called a lady of the night. His father was 19-year-old Paul McDowell, but he would not be part of Samuel's life for very long. The circumstances of Samuel's birth were troubled from the start. Some authorities believe his mother might have been in jail when she gave birth to him. The 1940 census listed Bessie Mae as working as a maid, but Samuel would later tell investigators that his mother was a prostitute who abandoned him when he was very young. Soon after his birth, the family moved north to Lorain, Ohio, a city outside of Cleveland on the shores of Lake Erie. Lorain was an industrial town, filled with steel mills and factories that employed thousands of workers. It was here that Samuel would spend most of his childhood, but not with his parents. His mother left him on his grandmother's doorstep when he was still very small, and it was his grandmother who would raise him. She did her best to provide for the young boy, but Samuel was troubled from an early age. Even as a small child, Samuel showed signs that something was not right. He would later tell investigators about having sexual fantasies involving strangling women that started when he was just 5 years old. He said it began when he saw his kindergarten teacher touch her neck, and that simple gesture gave him his first sexual feeling. This disturbing fascination would grow stronger as he got older. As a teenager, Samuel collected true crime magazines that showed pictures of women who had been strangled. He would pin these pictures to his bedroom wall and stare at them for hours. His grandmother probably had no idea what was happening in the young man's mind, but these early warning signs would prove to be the beginning of a lifetime of violence against women. Samuel attended Hawthorne Junior High School in Lorain, but he was not a good student. He was constantly getting into trouble, fighting with other students, and causing problems for his teachers. By the time he was 13 years old, his behavior had become so bad that he was sent away to the Boys Industrial School, a reform school outside of Columbus, Ohio. The Boys Industrial School was a harsh place, designed to straighten out troubled young men through strict discipline and hard work. Samuel spent a year and a half there, and during that time, he racked up 47 disciplinary infractions. He fought with other boys, refused to follow rules, and made life difficult for everyone around him. The experience at the reform school did nothing to fix whatever was wrong with Samuel. If anything, it may have made him worse. When Samuel was released from the reform school, he returned to Lorain, but he continued to get into trouble. In 1956, when he was just 16 years old, he was arrested for breaking and entering in Omaha, Nebraska. This was his first official arrest as an adult, though he had been causing problems for years before that. The arrest in Omaha marked the beginning of what would become a lifetime of run-ins with the law. After his arrest in Nebraska, Samuel was sent to an institution for juvenile offenders. The booking card from that arrest listed his mother's whereabouts as unknown, showing just how disconnected he was from his family. During his time in the juvenile facility, Samuel learned some skills that would serve him well in his criminal career, but not in a good way. He learned how to be more careful about not getting caught, and he also learned how to manipulate people to get what he wanted. Around the same time, Samuel broke into a dry cleaning business in Lorain and was caught. This led to another arrest and another stint in a reform institution, this time at the Ohio State Reformatory in Mansfield. The Mansfield Reformatory was a tough place, known for its harsh conditions and violent inmates. It was a massive stone building that looked more like a medieval castle than a prison, with high walls and guard towers that made escape nearly impossible. It was at Mansfield that Samuel learned to box. The prison had a boxing program that was supposed to help inmates burn off their aggressive energy in a controlled way. Samuel was naturally strong and athletic, standing 6 feet 3 inches tall with long arms that gave him a good reach. He took to boxing quickly and became quite good at it. He would later refer to himself as a former prize fighter, though there is little evidence that he ever fought professionally outside of prison. The boxing skills Samuel learned at Mansfield would become a crucial part of his method for killing women. His powerful punches could knock a woman unconscious with a single blow, making it easy for him to overpower his victims. Many of the women he would later kill probably never knew what hit them before they found themselves helpless in his hands. Samuel was paroled from Mansfield in December 1964, when he was 24 years old. By this time, he had spent most of his teenage years and early 20s in various institutions, and he had learned very little about how to live as a productive member of society. Instead, he had learned how to be a more effective criminal. After his release from prison, Samuel tried to settle down for a while. He even got married in Lorraine, but the marriage did not last long. His wife probably had no idea what kind of man she had married, and when she found out, she left him. Samuel would never have another serious relationship with a woman. Instead, he would develop a pattern of meeting women, using them for his own pleasure, and then discarding them in the most violent way possible. By the late 1960s, Samuel had left Ohio and moved to Miami, Florida. Miami in the late 60s was a city in transition. It was still recovering from the massive influx of Cuban refugees who had fled their homeland after Fidel Castro took power. The city had a large population of people who were struggling to make ends meet, including many women who turned to prostitution to survive. For someone like Samuel, who was looking for vulnerable victims, Miami was the perfect hunting ground. Samuel later told investigators that he worked various jobs during his time in Miami, including as a cemetery worker and an ambulance attendant. These jobs gave him access to dead bodies and may have helped fuel his obsession with death and violence. He also claimed that it was during this time that he began traveling more widely across the United States and that he had more run-ins with the law. Indeed, Samuel's criminal record shows that he was arrested in 8 different states during the 1970s and 1980s for crimes that included driving under the influence, fraud, shoplifting, solicitation of prostitution, armed robbery, aggravated assault, and rape. Despite this extensive criminal history, he managed to avoid serving long sentences in prison. He was skilled at manipulating the legal system, often pleading guilty to lesser charges to avoid more serious convictions. It was on New Year's Eve 1970, according to Samuel's own confession, that he committed his first murder. He was 30 years old and had been living in Miami for a couple of years. He met a woman in a bar, and after talking to her for a while, he convinced her to come with him to a secluded area in the Everglades. The woman's name was Mary, and she was a 30-year-old alcoholic who sometimes worked as a prostitute to make money. Samuel later told investigators that he had not planned to kill Mary that night. He said they were having sex when he accidentally strangled her. But this explanation does not ring true, given his long-standing obsession with strangling women and the careful way he disposed of her body afterward. After Mary was dead, Samuel tried to bury her in the swampy ground of the Everglades, but he was not successful. Her body was partially exposed when it was found years later. What Samuel did next shows that this was not an accident, but the beginning of a planned series of murders. He returned to the same area in the Everglades shortly after killing Mary and murdered another woman. This time, he was more careful about hiding the body, and it was never found. The woman's identity remains unknown to this day. Samuel would later describe the feeling of killing as being like taking drugs. He said he came to like it, and that it gave him a rush that nothing else could provide. This admission shows that he was not killing out of rage or in the heat of the moment, but because he enjoyed it. He was what psychologists call a thrill killer, someone who murders for the pleasure it gives them. Over the next few months, Samuel killed at least 2 more women in the Miami area. One was named Karen O'Donoghue, a 25-year-old woman who had previously run away from her wedding because she was afraid to get married. Samuel met her in a bar and convinced her to come with him. Like the others, her body was never recovered. The other was a 22-year-old black woman whose name might have been Linda. She was also killed in the countryside outside Miami, and her body was never found. As 1971 progressed, Samuel continued to kill. He murdered at least 1 more woman in Florida, a white woman who might have been named Sarah or Donna. This time, he buried her in a shallow grave in Kendall, Florida. Her body was found years later, but she was never identified. By the end of 1971, Samuel had killed at least 5 women, and he was just getting started. Samuel's method of operation was becoming clear. He would meet women in bars, often women who were involved in prostitution or who were struggling with drug or alcohol problems. These were women who lived on the edges of society, women who might not be immediately missed if they disappeared. Samuel was careful to choose victims who would not leave much evidence behind and whose disappearances might not be thoroughly investigated by police. After meeting a woman and gaining her trust, Samuel would convince her to come with him to a secluded location. Sometimes he offered them money for sex, sometimes he offered them drugs, and sometimes he just offered them a ride to where they needed to go. Once he had them alone, he would use his boxing skills to knock them unconscious with a powerful punch to the head. Then, while they were helpless, he would strangle them with his bare hands. Samuel told investigators that he often masturbated while he was strangling his victims, showing that the murders were sexually motivated. He got sexual pleasure from the act of killing, from watching the life drain out of his victims' eyes. This made him particularly dangerous because he was not killing for money or revenge or any other typical motive. He was killing because it felt good to him. After killing his victims, Samuel was careful about disposing of their bodies. He often dumped them in remote areas where they might not be found for a long time, if ever. He also chose locations where the bodies would decompose quickly, making it harder for investigators to determine the cause of death. Many of his victims' deaths were initially ruled to be drug overdoses or natural deaths because there were no obvious signs of violence. This was one of the key reasons Samuel was able to get away with murder for so long. His method of killing, manual strangulation, did not always leave obvious physical evidence. Unlike strangulation with a rope or other object, manual strangulation might not leave visible marks on the victim's neck, especially if the body was not found for several days or weeks. Medical examiners in the 1970s and 1980s were not as sophisticated as they are today in detecting signs of manual strangulation. So many of Samuel's victims' deaths were not classified as homicides. As the 1970s progressed, Samuel continued to travel across the United States, leaving a trail of dead women behind him. He killed in Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, Tennessee, Kentucky, Ohio, Texas, California, Nevada, Arkansas, and many other states. He was constantly on the move, never staying in one place long enough for a pattern to be noticed. In 1972, Samuel was arrested again and sent back to prison for several months. This temporarily stopped his killing spree, but as soon as he was released, he resumed murdering women. Being in prison actually seemed to make him more careful about his crimes. He learned from other inmates about how to avoid leaving evidence behind, and he became even more selective about choosing victims who would not be missed. Throughout the 1970s, Samuel killed dozens of women. The exact number is not known because many of the bodies were never found, and many of the deaths that were discovered were not classified as murders. Samuel himself lost count of how many women he had killed, telling investigators that he stopped counting after 84 victims. Some of the women Samuel killed during this period have been identified through his confessions and subsequent investigations. In 1974, he killed Linda Belcher, a 22-year-old single mother in Phoenix, Arizona. Her body was found, but the case went unsolved for decades until Samuel confessed to her murder. That same year, he killed Leola Etta Bryant, a 51-year-old woman in South Carolina. Her body was also found years later and confirmed as one of his victims. In Tennessee, Samuel killed Martha Cunningham, a 34-year-old woman he abducted from a bar on New Year's Eve 1974. Her body was found, but the cause of death was unclear at the time. He also killed an unidentified woman in Knox County, Tennessee, whose body was never found and whose identity remains unknown. As the 1970s turned into the 1980s, Samuel's killing spree continued. He was becoming more confident and more brazen in his crimes. He no longer felt the need to hide his actions as carefully as he had in the early years. This overconfidence would eventually lead to his downfall, but it would take many more years and many more victims before that happened. In the early 1980s, Samuel was arrested twice for murder, once in Florida and once in Mississippi. In both cases, he was acquitted or the charges were dropped due to lack of evidence. These close calls should have been a warning to him that law enforcement was starting to notice a pattern. but instead, they seemed to make him feel invincible. He believed that he was too smart to be caught and that he could continue killing without consequences. The Florida case involved the murder of a mentally disabled woman in 1982. Samuel was accused of strangling her, but he was acquitted at trial. The Mississippi case that same year involved the death of a prostitute who was also strangled. A grand jury declined to indict Samuel in that case, meaning that the prosecutors did not believe they had enough evidence to convict him. Both of these cases involved the same method of killing that Samuel had been using for years: strangulation of vulnerable women. If investigators had been able to connect these cases to the many other similar murders across the country, they might have realized that they were dealing with a serial killer. But the technology and communication systems that would have made such connections possible did not exist in the 1980s. Instead, Samuel was free to continue his killing spree. He moved to California in the mid-1980s and began hunting for victims in the Los Angeles area. Los Angeles was perfect for Samuel's purposes. It was a huge city with a large population of transient people, including many women involved in prostitution and drug use. It was easy for women to disappear in Los Angeles without anyone noticing, and it was easy for Samuel to blend into the crowd. Between 1987 and 1989, Samuel killed at least 3 women in Los Angeles. Their names were Carol Alford, Audrey Nelson, and Guadalupe Apodaca. These murders would eventually be the ones that brought Samuel to justice, but at the time, they were just 3 more unsolved cases in a city that had hundreds of unsolved murders every year. Carol Alford was 41 years old when Samuel killed her in July 1987. She was found in an alley in South Los Angeles, her body partially clothed and left among garbage and debris. The scene looked like many other crime scenes in the area, and investigators initially thought she might have been killed by a John who had gotten violent during a transaction. Audrey Nelson was 35 years old when she died in August 1989. Her body was found in a parking garage, and like Carol Alford, she appeared to have been beaten and strangled. There was DNA evidence under her fingernails, showing that she had fought for her life, clawing at her attacker as he choked the life out of her. But DNA testing was still in its early stages in 1989, and the evidence was stored away without being analyzed. Guadalupe Apodaca was 46 years old when Samuel killed her in September 1989. Her body was found in a dumpster, and like the other 2 women, she had been beaten and strangled. The 3 murders had enough similarities that investigators suspected they might be connected, but they had no way to prove it at the time. After killing these 3 women in Los Angeles, Samuel left California and continued his cross-country killing spree. He killed women in Texas, Louisiana, Ohio, Kentucky, Nevada, and many other states. Each murder followed the same basic pattern. He would meet a vulnerable woman, gain her trust, take her to a secluded location, knock her unconscious, and then strangle her while sexually gratifying himself. Throughout the 1990s and into the 2000s, Samuel continued to kill. He was getting older, but his appetite for murder had not diminished. If anything, he was becoming more skilled at choosing victims and disposing of bodies. He had learned from decades of experience how to avoid leaving evidence behind, and he had developed a sixth sense for choosing women who would not be missed. Some of the women Samuel killed during this period have been identified. In Louisiana, he killed Dorothy Richards, a 55-year-old woman, in 1982, and Daisy McGuire, a 40-year-old woman, in 1996. Both of their bodies were found in Houma, Louisiana, but the cases went unsolved for years. In Ohio, he killed Anna Stewart, a 33-year-old woman whose body was dumped in Grove City, Ohio, in 1981. Stewart was last seen getting out of a cab at a hospital where she was going to visit her sister. In Texas, Samuel killed Denise Christie Brothers in 1994 in Odessa. This murder would prove to be crucial in eventually bringing Samuel to justice, because it was the case that first caught the attention of investigators who would later uncover the full extent of his crimes. Denise was a local woman who disappeared one day and was found dead a short time later. The case went unsolved for years, but investigators never gave up on it. By 2005, Samuel was 65 years old and still killing. His last confirmed murder was in Tupelo, Mississippi, where he strangled another woman and left her body to be found by someone else. After that, he seemed to slow down his killing spree, possibly because he was getting older and less physically capable of overpowering younger women. For the next several years, Samuel lived a relatively quiet life, traveling around the country and living in homeless shelters and cheap motels. He supported himself through petty crimes like shoplifting and fraud, but he was not committing any major crimes. It seemed like his days as a serial killer were over, but the evidence of his past crimes was still out there, waiting to be discovered. In 2012, Samuel's past finally caught up with him. He was living in a homeless shelter in Louisville, Kentucky, when U.S. Marshals arrived to arrest him on an outstanding drug warrant from Los Angeles. Samuel was 72 years old at the time, and he probably thought that the warrant was just another minor legal problem that he could handle with a plea bargain and a short sentence. But when Samuel was extradited to Los Angeles to face the drug charges, investigators decided to take another look at some old, unsolved cases. DNA technology had advanced significantly since the 1980s, and many police departments were going back through their cold case files to see if new technology could help solve old crimes. Investigators in Los Angeles had DNA evidence from the 3 murders in the late 1980s, and they decided to run it through the state's DNA database to see if they could get a match. When Samuel was booked into jail on the drug charges, his DNA was collected as part of the standard booking process. Within a few weeks, the lab results came back with a match. Samuel's DNA was found on the clothing of 2 of the victims and under the fingernails of the 3rd. This was solid evidence that he had been in contact with all 3 women around the time of their deaths. For the first time in his criminal career, Samuel was facing charges that he could not talk his way out of or plead down to lesser offenses. The Los Angeles Police Department detectives who worked the case, Rick Jackson and Mitzi Roberts, were experienced investigators who specialized in cold cases. They had seen many criminals over the years, but there was something different about Samuel. He was calm and collected, almost cheerful, even when confronted with evidence of his crimes. Most criminals would be nervous or angry when facing murder charges, but Samuel seemed almost amused by the whole situation. When detectives questioned Samuel about the murders, he denied any involvement. He claimed that he had never met any of the 3 women and that the DNA evidence must have been contaminated or planted. This was a common defense strategy, but it was not very convincing given the strength of the evidence against him. As the investigation continued, detectives began to realize that they might be dealing with more than just 3 murders. Samuel had been arrested in multiple states over the years, and his pattern of movement seemed to coincide with unsolved murders in many different locations. Detectives contacted the FBI's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, known as VICAP, to see if there were any patterns that might connect Samuel to other crimes. Christy Palazzolo, a crime analyst with VICAP, began looking into Samuel's background and criminal history. What she found was alarming. Samuel had been arrested in dozens of cities across the United States, and in many of those cities, there were unsolved murders of women that fit his method of operation. The murders involved women who were beaten and strangled, often prostitutes or drug addicts, and the bodies were frequently dumped in alleys or remote areas. As Palazzolo dug deeper into the cases, she found more and more connections. In some cities, Samuel had been arrested for minor crimes just days or weeks before a woman was found murdered. In other cities, he had been seen in the area around the time that women disappeared. The pattern was clear. Samuel had been killing women for decades, and law enforcement had never connected the dots. In 2013, Samuel was charged with 3 counts of murder in Los Angeles. He was assigned a public defender, Michael Pence, who tried to build a defense based on the argument that the DNA evidence was not enough to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Pence argued that Samuel might have had contact with the women without killing them, and that someone else could have been the actual murderer. But the prosecution, led by Deputy District Attorney Beth Silverman, had a strong case. In addition to the DNA evidence, they had testimony from several women who had survived attacks by Samuel. These women described being picked up by Samuel, taken to secluded locations, and then beaten and choked. They had managed to escape or fight him off, but their experiences were very similar to what the 3 murder victims must have gone through. The trial began in 2014, and it lasted for several weeks. Samuel, now 74 years old, sat in a wheelchair during the proceedings, claiming to be too frail to stand for long periods. But witnesses described him as having been a powerful man in his younger years, easily capable of overpowering the women he attacked. During the trial, prosecutors presented evidence that Samuel had a long history of violence against women. He had been accused of rape and assault in multiple states, and he had a pattern of targeting vulnerable women who were unlikely to be believed if they reported his crimes. The prosecution argued that Samuel was a predator who had spent his entire adult life hunting and killing women. The defense tried to paint Samuel as a victim of circumstance, a man who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. They argued that his extensive criminal record was mostly for nonviolent crimes like theft and drug possession, and that he had never been convicted of murder before. They also suggested that the DNA evidence could have been contaminated or that the lab tests could have been flawed. But the jury was not convinced by the defense arguments. The DNA evidence was overwhelming, and the testimony from the surviving victims painted a clear picture of Samuel as a dangerous predator. On September 2nd, 2014, the jury found Samuel guilty on all 3 counts of first-degree murder. At his sentencing hearing, Samuel showed no remorse for his crimes. He interrupted family members of the victims who were giving impact statements, claiming that he was innocent and that he had been framed. He called the prosecution a legal lynching and said that he hoped to get a new trial on appeal. But Judge George Lamelli was not impressed by Samuel's protests. On September 25th, 2014, he sentenced Samuel to 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. At 74 years old, Samuel would spend the rest of his life in prison, and he would never have the chance to hurt another woman. After his conviction, Samuel was transferred to a California state prison to begin serving his sentence. For the next few years, he maintained his innocence and refused to cooperate with investigators who wanted to question him about other unsolved cases. He seemed content to take his secrets to the grave, but that would change in 2018 when a Texas Ranger named James Holland came to visit him. Holland was investigating the 1994 murder of Denise Christie brothers in Odessa, Texas. He had heard about Samuel's conviction in California and thought there might be a connection to his case. In May 2018, Holland traveled to California with 2 FBI crime analysts to interview Samuel about the Texas murder. Holland was an experienced investigator who had developed a reputation for being able to get suspects to talk. He was patient and persistent, and he had a way of building rapport with even the most hardened criminals. When he first met Samuel, he did not immediately accuse him of murder. Instead, he talked to him about his life, his travels, and his experiences. Over the course of several interviews, Holland gradually gained Samuel's trust. He treated Samuel with respect and listened to his stories without judgment. Slowly, Samuel began to open up about his past, and eventually, he began to talk about the murders he had committed. The breakthrough came when Samuel confessed to killing Denise Christie brothers in Texas. He provided details about the murder that only the killer would know, including where he had met Denise, how he had killed her, and where he had left her body. Holland knew that he had found the right man, but he also suspected that this was just the beginning. Over the next several months, Holland continued to interview Samuel, sometimes talking to him for hours at a time. Samuel seemed to enjoy the attention and the opportunity to talk about his crimes. He began confessing to murders in state after state, providing details that investigators were able to verify through their case files. As Samuel talked, a horrific picture emerged. He had been killing women for over 30 years, from 1970 to 2005. He had traveled to dozens of states and had murdered women in cities large and small. Most of his victims were Black women who were involved in prostitution or drug use, women who lived on the margins of society and whose disappearances were not thoroughly investigated. Samuel told Holland that he had killed 93 women in total, though he admitted that he might have forgotten some victims over the years. He said that he had lost count after 84 murders and that there might be even more victims that he could not remember. This number made Samuel the most prolific serial killer in American history, surpassing even notorious killers like Ted Bundy and John Wayne Gacy. What made Samuel's confessions particularly valuable was the level of detail he provided. He had an excellent memory for his crimes, and he could describe exactly where he had met each victim, what she looked like, how he had killed her, and where he had left her body. He even drew pictures of many of his victims, creating portraits that investigators could use to try to identify the women. Samuel's artistic ability came as a surprise to investigators. He had never had any formal training in art, but he was able to create remarkably detailed and lifelike portraits of his victims. He drew these pictures from memory, sometimes decades after the murders, but the faces he created were so realistic that investigators were able to use them to solve cold cases. The FBI began releasing Samuel's drawings to the public, hoping that someone would recognize one of the faces and come forward with information. In several cases, this strategy worked. Family members recognized their missing loved ones in Samuel's drawings, and investigators were able to confirm that these women had indeed been murdered by Samuel. As word of Samuel's confession spread, law enforcement agencies from across the country began contacting Holland and the FBI. They had unsolved cases that fit Samuel's method of operation, and they wanted to know if he had been responsible for murders in their jurisdictions. Over the next 2 years, investigators worked to verify Samuel's confessions and connect them to specific cases. The task was enormous. Samuel had confessed to murders in at least 16 states, spanning a period of 35 years. Many of the cases were decades old, and the original investigators had retired or died. Evidence had been lost or destroyed, and witnesses had moved away or passed away. Despite these challenges, investigators were able to confirm many of Samuel's confessions through DNA evidence, crime scene details, and other corroborating information. By 2019, the FBI had verified 60 of Samuel's 93 confessions, with many more still under investigation. The agency announced that Samuel was officially the most prolific serial killer in American history, surpassing all previous records. The announcement sent shockwaves through the law enforcement community and the general public, as people struggled to comprehend the scale of Samuel's crimes. What made Samuel's case particularly disturbing was not just the number of his victims, but the way he had been able to operate for so long without being caught. He had been arrested over 100 times during his criminal career, but he had never served more than a few years in prison at a time. He had been accused of rape and assault by multiple women, but he had never been convicted of these serious crimes. The reason Samuel was able to avoid detection for so long was partly due to his careful selection of victims. He targeted women who were marginalized and vulnerable, women whose disappearances might not be immediately noticed or thoroughly investigated. Many of his victims were prostitutes, drug addicts, or homeless women who had little contact with family or friends. When these women disappeared, law enforcement often assumed that they had simply moved on to another city or had died from drug overdoses or other natural causes. Samuel also benefited from the fact that he was constantly moving from city to city and state to state. In the 1970s and 1980s, communication between law enforcement agencies was limited, and there was no centralized system for tracking serial killers who operated across multiple jurisdictions. Each murder was investigated as a separate case, and investigators had no way of knowing that similar crimes were being committed hundreds or thousands of miles away. Another factor that helped Samuel avoid detection was his method of killing. Manual strangulation does not always leave obvious physical evidence, especially if the body is not found for several days or weeks. Many of Samuel's victims' deaths were initially classified as drug overdoses, accidents, or natural causes, because medical examiners did not recognize the subtle signs of strangulation. Samuel was also skilled at avoiding leaving physical evidence at crime scenes. He was careful not to leave fingerprints, and he usually disposed of his victims' clothing and personal belongings in ways that made them difficult to trace back to him. It was only with the advent of DNA testing in the 1990s and 2000s that investigators were finally able to connect him to his crimes. As investigators worked to verify Samuel's confessions, they also tried to understand what had motivated him to kill so many women. Samuel himself provided some insights during his interviews with Holland. He said that killing gave him a sexual thrill that nothing else could match. He compared it to taking drugs, saying that he became addicted to the feeling of power he got from taking a woman's life. Samuel also revealed that he had developed elaborate fantasies about his crimes. He would spend hours thinking about potential victims, planning how he would approach them and where he would take them. He said that the anticipation was almost as exciting as the actual murder, and that he would often revisit crime scenes in his mind long after the victims were dead. Psychologists who studied Samuel's case noted that he displayed many of the characteristics of a psychopathic serial killer. He showed no empathy for his victims, no remorse for his crimes, and no concern for the families he had destroyed. He seemed to view his victims not as human beings, but as objects that existed solely for his pleasure and satisfaction. Samuel's childhood experiences may have contributed to his development as a serial killer. His abandonment by his mother, his troubled relationship with his father, and his early exposure to violence and dysfunction all played a role in shaping his personality. However, many people experience similar childhood traumas without becoming serial killers, so it is impossible to say that these factors alone caused Samuel's criminal behavior. What is clear is that Samuel made a conscious choice to hurt women, and he continued making that choice for over 30 years. He had numerous opportunities to seek help for his violent impulses, but he chose instead to embrace them and act on them repeatedly. He showed a complete disregard for human life and a willingness to cause immense suffering for his own gratification. As investigators continued to work on Samuel's case, they also focused on bringing closure to the families of his victims. Many of these families had been waiting for decades to learn what had happened to their loved ones. Some had never given up hope that their missing family members might still be alive, while others had accepted that their loved ones were probably dead but had never known how or why they had died. The identification of Samuel's victims was a painstaking process that involved DNA testing, dental records, and other forensic techniques. In some cases, investigators were able to identify victims within a few months of Samuel's confessions. In other cases, the process took years, and some victims have still not been identified. One of the most important identifications was that of Yvonne Pless, a young woman whose remains had been found in Macon, Georgia, in 1977. For 46 years, she had been known only as Macon Jane Doe, but genetic genealogy finally allowed investigators to determine her identity. Pless was about 20 years old when Samuel killed her, and she was his first confirmed victim in Georgia. Another significant identification was that of Clara Birdlong, whose remains were found near a Mississippi highway in 1977. She had been known as Escatapa Jane Doe for nearly 44 years before investigators were able to determine her identity. These identifications brought some measure of closure to the families, even though it came decades after their loved ones had been killed. As Samuel's health began to decline in his final years, investigators worked frantically to get as much information from him as possible. They knew that he was the only person who could provide details about many of his crimes, and they were afraid that crucial information would die with him. Samuel suffered from diabetes, heart disease, and other health problems that are common in elderly inmates. He was confined to a wheelchair and required constant medical care. Despite his poor health, he continued to cooperate with investigators, providing information about unsolved cases and helping to identify more of his victims. On December 30th, 2020, Samuel Little died at a hospital in California. He was 80 years old and had been serving his life sentences for nearly 6 years. His death marked the end of one of the most extensive serial killer investigations in American history, but it also left many questions unanswered. At the time of Samuel's death, investigators had confirmed 62 of his 93 confessions, with the remaining 31 cases still under investigation. Some of these cases may never be solved, either because the evidence has been lost or destroyed, or because Samuel's confessions contained inaccuracies or gaps in his memory. The impact of Samuel's crimes extended far beyond the immediate victims and their families. His case highlighted serious problems in the American criminal justice system, including the lack of communication between law enforcement agencies, the inadequate investigation of crimes against marginalized women, and the failure to recognize patterns of serial killing. Samuel's case also demonstrated the importance of DNA technology in solving cold cases. Without DNA evidence, it is unlikely that he would ever have been connected to the Los Angeles murders, and his decades-long killing spree might never have been discovered. The case showed how advances in forensic science could help bring justice to victims and their families, even many years after the crimes were committed. For the law enforcement officers who worked on Samuel's case, it was both a triumph and a tragedy. They were proud of their work in identifying one of the most prolific serial killers in history and bringing some measure of justice to his victims. But they were also haunted by the knowledge that Samuel had been able to kill so many women without being stopped, and that many of his victims might still be alive if the system had worked better. Texas Ranger James Holland, who had conducted the crucial interviews with Samuel, became something of a celebrity in law enforcement circles. He was praised for his skill in getting Samuel to confess and for his dedication to solving cold cases. However, Holland also faced some criticism for his interrogation techniques, with some observers questioning whether his methods were always ethical or legal. Despite these controversies, there is no doubt that Holland's work was instrumental in uncovering the full extent of Samuel's crimes. Without his patient and persistent questioning, Many of Samuel's victims might never have been identified, and their families would never have learned the truth about what happened to their loved ones. The Samuel Little case also had a significant impact on the FBI's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program. The program had been created in the 1980s to help law enforcement agencies share information about violent crimes and identify patterns that might indicate serial killing. Samuel's case showed both the value of the program and its limitations, as it took decades for investigators to recognize the full scope of his crimes. As a result of the Samuel Little case, VICAP has worked to improve its methods for identifying serial killers and connecting crimes across jurisdictions. The program has also emphasized the importance of investigating crimes against marginalized victims with the same thoroughness as crimes against more privileged victims. The case has also led to discussions about how society treats vulnerable women, particularly those involved in prostitution or drug use. Many of Samuel's victims were dismissed by law enforcement and society as being less important than other crime victims, and this attitude may have contributed to Samuel's ability to continue killing for so long. Advocates for sex workers and other marginalized groups have used Samuel's case to argue for better protection and support for vulnerable women. They point out that these women are human beings who deserve the same level of police protection and investigation as anyone else, and that society's indifference to their welfare makes them easy targets for predators like Samuel. The legacy of Samuel Little's crimes will continue to be felt for many years to come. Investigators are still working to identify his remaining victims and to bring closure to their families. The case has also inspired changes in law enforcement practices and has highlighted the importance of treating all victims with dignity and respect, regardless of their background or circumstances. For the families of Samuel's victims, the knowledge that their loved one's killer has been identified and punished provides some measure of comfort, but it cannot undo the decades of pain and uncertainty they have endured. Many of these families have had to grieve their loved ones twice, once when they first disappeared or were found dead, and again when they learned the horrible truth about how they died. The Samuel Little case serves as a reminder of the importance of never giving up on unsolved cases, no matter how old they are or how unlikely it seems that they will ever be solved. It also demonstrates the value of new technologies and investigative techniques in bringing justice to victims and their families. Perhaps most importantly, the case shows the need for society to value and protect all of its members, especially those who are most vulnerable. Samuel Little was able to kill so many women because he correctly calculated that their deaths would not be thoroughly investigated or widely mourned. This is a tragedy that reflects not just on Samuel himself, but on all of us as members of a society that allowed such indifference to exist. The story of Samuel Little is ultimately a story about the failure of systems designed to protect people and bring justice to victims. It is a story about how a man was able to spend over 30 years killing women because those women were considered disposable by much of society. It is also a story about the dedication of investigators who refused to give up on cold cases and who worked tirelessly to bring some measure of justice to Samuel's victims. As we remember the women who died at Samuel's hands, we must also remember the lessons their deaths teach us about the importance of protecting the vulnerable, investigating all crimes thoroughly, and never giving up on the pursuit of justice. Only by learning from these lessons can we hope to prevent future tragedies like the one that Samuel Little inflicted on so many families across America. The name Samuel Little will forever be associated with one of the darkest chapters in American criminal history. But the names of his victims, Mary, Carol, Audrey, Guadalupe, Yvonne, Clara, and the dozens of others who have been identified or remain unknown, should be remembered not just as statistics in a record-breaking case, but as individual human beings who deserved better from the society that failed to protect them. Their deaths were tragic and senseless, but their memory can serve as a reminder of our responsibility to protect all members of our community,